The hallway always smelled like lavender on Mondays. It was the scent he pretended not to notice, but it made him close his eyes for a second longer when he passed by. The house was silent, spotless, and all the clocks were perfectly synchronized, except Douglas's heart. Ever since he sent away the only woman he had ever dared to call indispensable, he had been living with an emptiness that not even millions could fill. He said it was out of professionalism, that he couldn't afford to get attached. But no one came into that guest room anymore. No one turned on the lights in the morning anymore. No one sang softly as they swept the porch anymore. And now, too late, he realizes that the silence he chose to maintain was exactly the noise that was killing him inside. Douglas Hamilton was the kind of man who made decisions with a nod, surgical, direct, impassive. That autumn afternoon, with the dry branches brushing against the glass of his window, he simply muttered, "No longer. Necessary, thank you," and went back to typing. She nodded with her eyes downcast, didn't cry, didn't ask for an explanation. She simply tightened her old coat, which he had given her last Christmas, and left through the door that would never open the same way again. The following days were the same on paper. Meetings, investments, stocks rising. But time began to move strangely. The house seemed bigger, the light colder, the bathroom mirror crueler. And what Douglas didn't know, what no one imagined, was that fate usually keeps its accounts with those who judge too much what they feel too little. If you feel that this story has something to say to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and come with us, because what is to come may speak directly to your heart. He used to wake up at 5:45 sharp, even if there was no reason at all. His routine was almost military. Freshly brewed black coffee, a towel changed every 2 days, a starched white shirt with creases that could cut through the air. Douglas Hamilton was not a difficult man to understand. He was predictable to the bone. Everything about him was calculated. His house, his car, his company, his contacts, his smile. Every gesture seemed rehearsed to maintain distance. He said he preferred it that way, that too much involvement was disguised weakness. But what no one saw was what happened when the world wasn't looking. Because there, in the spaces where the eyes couldn't reach, there was a presence he wouldn't admit. Her name was Eleanor. And even though she was just the housekeeper, there was something about her that didn't fit into the word service. The first time she walked in, it was raining. Douglas barely looked up from the newspaper. He just said that the cleaning products were in the laundry cupboard. She answered with a "yes, sir," so sweet and calm that it echoed in his mind for days. Not out of submission, but out of something he didn't yet have the language to name, a silent care. Elena never tried to cross the line. She never got closer than she should have, never smiled longer than was allowed, never lingered in the room when he came in. But her gestures had a voice of their own. She noticed when he was late and left his cup of tea ready on the side table next to his armchair. She collected his old newspapers and folded them into piles he hadn't asked for. She watered the dead plant in his office, even though she knew it wouldn't come back to life. And maybe that was exactly what bothered him the most, the way she saw the silent pain in places and cared for it. Douglas never commented on it, but he began to notice that his breathing was lighter on the days Elena was around, that his anger didn't explode as easily, that the hallways seemed less empty when the sound of the vacuum cleaner and her soft humming filled the space. But Douglas was a man accustomed to closing doors. He thought it was strength. That cutting ties was a survival strategy. And so, when Eleanor's eyes began to stare into his for a second longer than before, he backed away. He ordered her to double the distance, reduced her glances, and started leaving orders on notes. Eleanor didn't react. She just obeyed with the same discreet sweetness. Until one day, he decided, without drama, without scandal, without even looking her in the eyes, he just said, "That won't be necessary anymore, thank you." She just nodded and left, with the same delicacy with which she had always been there. That night Douglas arrived in the kitchen. Everything was clean, spotless, but the kettle was missing. The mug with his name on it was missing either, and worst of all, the silence was now screaming, a silence that, ironically, he himself created. and that, from then on, would never leave him in peace. The first week passed as if nothing had happened. Douglas woke up at the same time, made his own coffee, with the same coolness with which he signed million-dollar contracts. He even thought that the discomfort in his chest was just a habit. Maybe he was just addicted to the presence of someone who made the environment feel good, like a perfume that dissolves in the air. But on the seventh day, something strange happened. He opened the pantry door and couldn't find what he needed. She always left the items organized by category, lined up like a library shelf. Now the jars were mixed up, the labels turned backwards, the salt in place of the sugar. It was ridiculous, he thought, to feel angry over something so small, but it was at that exact moment that he realized she was part of the harmony of that house far more than he would like to admit. And that was when the flashes began. He began to remember the details, and they infuriated him. The way Elena folded the covers and left a little flower from the garden on the nightstand on Monday mornings. The way she cleaned the windows, always whistling the same tune, a song he didn't know the name of, but which now echoed in the emptiness of the house. In the dining room, the light reflected differently. It was no longer warm. The cleaning done by another employee, hired by an agency, was technically perfect, but it lacked soul. It lacked the silent care that only those who love in silence can leave in things. The towels were clean but rough. The dishes were in the cupboard but turned the wrong way. Everything was subtle, but everything was wrong. He tried to make up for it. He ordered flowers to be brought into the garden. He increased the number of servants. He ordered more elaborate dinners. He tried to fill the house with life with the weight of his money. But it was no use, because what Elena had left behind could not be bought. It was as if she had imbued the house with a kind of invisible love, the kind you only notice when it's gone. And the more he tried to ignore it, the more the emptiness grew. He began to come home later, to sleep less, to feel a constant impatience. The sounds in the house began to bother him. The creaking of the floor, previously muffled by Elena's broom, now seemed to mock his silence. One night he opened his office drawer looking for a contract and found, among forgotten papers, an embroidered handkerchief. It was hers. With her initials hand-sewn on it in a discreet corner, he held it for a few seconds, as if he were looking at an unwritten letter. He smelled it. It was hers. Not a strong perfume, but that smell of cleanliness, of home, of presence. He stood, there alone, holding a piece of cloth as if it were a relic. And in that moment, he understood something he would never admit out loud. He had not fired an employee. He had fired the only part of the house that still made sense. The pain didn't come as a blow, but as a whisper. Slowly, day after day, it spread through Douglas's routine like an invisible infiltration. He tried to maintain control, as he always had, but he was failing at the little things. He began to forget appointments, to leave important papers out of place, to repeat questions he had already asked. It wasn't tiredness, it was absence. A kind of loneliness that sets in when we lose something we never had the courage to call by its name. In silence, Douglas began to revisit memories that he had pushed into the basement of his memory. And they were always the same scenes. Elena sweeping the leaves in the garden in the late afternoon, her careful hands as she folded his shirts, the discreet look she gave him when he coughed or came back from a bad day. He began to remember in painful detail every little gesture he had ignored, like the note on the table with recommendations about his diet, which she would leave when she noticed he wasn't eating right, like the cups, organized by color and frequency of use, like the medicine she discreetly refilled in the bathroom drawer without him noticing. She took care of him, even without permission, and that now hurt like an open wound, because out of pride, out of fear, out of this armor he wore to protect himself from the world, he pretended not to notice. And now, even surrounded by servants, luxury, and expensive silence, he felt like a wanderer inside his own home. The hallways were clean, but they didn't smell like home. The garden was full of flowers, but dull. Even the clock in the kitchen seemed to mark time with more cruelty. Everything about him was now conscious. Every corner of the house that had previously gone unnoticed was now a reminder, a silent altar to the woman he had let go. Douglas began to walk more slowly, as if he expected that in some corner of the house she would still be there, distracted, smiling at nothing. Sometimes he could almost swear he heard light footsteps or the sound of the laundry room door closing, but it was only his mind, and perhaps his guilt. He didn't confess, but he started doing little things that reminded him of Elena. He started watering the plants she used to take care of. He tried to recreate the chamomile tea recipe she used to make. She even bought an old radio just to tune into a station that played songs similar to the ones she sang. It was as if somehow he was trying to make amends, albeit late. Not with words, because Douglas didn't know how to ask for forgiveness, but with small gestures, the kind that only those who have loved in silence can understand. And it was in this painful and lonely process that he began to realize there was a kind of longing that doesn't go away. The kind that comes from everything that could have been, but that fear destroyed. The day of his dismissal was, on the surface, completely ordinary. The sky was clear, the temperature mild, and there were no urgent meetings at the office. Douglas had woken up before the alarm clock and had his coffee in silence, his eyes fixed on the newspaper as usual. Eleanor arrived on time, greeted him with a soft "good morning," and went to the laundry room, without waiting for a response. It was a morning, like any other, and perhaps that was why it hurt so much. Because it was precisely in the banality of that day that the decision fell like a blade, cold, without warning, without heart. He had been rehearsing that cut for weeks, convinced that keeping his distance would be more professional. After all, the house was a place for work, not for affection, and any other feeling that grew there would be weakness. That was the excuse he repeated to himself, a lie that he forced himself to believe. Late in the morning, he called her into his office. She arrived with clean hands and a cloth still folded in her apron pocket. He didn't even look up from his computer. He said the words as if he were signing some kind of contract. "You are free to go as of today. The outsourcing company will send someone else." Pause. There is no need to call back. That was it. No gratitude, no justification, no acknowledgement of the years of complicit silence. Elena didn't cry. She didn't show surprise. She just nodded with a restrained movement, as if she had expected it, or as if she knew that the pain was greater for the one sending someone away than for the one leaving. She thanked him politely, gently removed her apron, and went to the utility room to get her belongings. 4 items, just 4. A change of clothes, a prayer book, a blue scarf, and an old photo of a child. Douglas watched her leave through the entrance camera, as he did with any delivery or employee. But when she saw the door, close behind her, a dry, almost silent sound reverberated strangely throughout the house. That night he had insomnia for the first time in months. He tried to convince himself that it was the caffeine's fault, that it was just discomfort from having changed his routine. But deep down he knew he had broken something that could not be mended. The following days were a failed attempt to move on. The new employee arrived, cold, objective, efficient. She did everything right, except the essential. She didn't see what Elena saw. She didn't notice the crumbs on the carpet before they fell. She didn't leave her favorite bread next to the cup. She didn't wait for the car to leave the garage to calmly water the plants. She cleaned, but she didn't live. And that made all the difference. Douglas began working outside more often, trying to escape the feeling that the house was staring at him. The paintings looked askew. The lights reflected in a way that made him look like shadows. He began to avoid certain rooms, especially the porch. That was where Elena sang. That was where he pretended not to hear her, but he did. Now there was only silence. Silence and wind. He hadn't expected her absence to be so loud. Instead of bringing peace, Elena's departure had turned the house into a field of echoes. Every corner carried traces of what had once been. The couch still had a subtle crease in the right arm, where she'd dusted it most often. The living room curtains swayed differently when the wind blew in, maybe because no one was holding them on the left side anymore, like she used to do to keep them from hitting the vases. Douglas began to notice these things, not as someone who observes, but as someone who misses her. Eleanor's absence wasn't just physical, it was sensory. Everything about her was memory. And now, every memory seemed to poke at a part of her he'd spent his life trying to numb. He didn't tell anyone, but he started going to bed earlier, not because he was tired, but to escape the emptiness. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and go to the kitchen, where she would leave a note with a reminder or a Bible verse written in delicate handwriting. There was no note anymore, just the clean table, the still clock, and the sound of his own regret. Douglas didn't know the name of what he felt. Guilt, longing, regret, maybe all at once. But he didn't know what to do with it. His pride wouldn't allow him to seek contact. His rigidity didn't know how to back down. And so he did what he always did, nothing. The following weeks were like walking through a house where the lights still worked, but no one turned them on anymore. Everything remained in its place, but lifeless. New employees came and went. None of them stayed for more than 2 weeks. One of them even said discreetly that the house seemed sad. Douglas pretended not to hear. He continued living as if each day were the same, as if his order had been fair, necessary, logical. But his eyes gave it away. He avoided mirrors because he knew that there lived a truth he could not control. Sometimes when I arrived, I felt the urge to call for her, not out loud, but in my mind, as if she were still there somewhere, disguised as a memory. The cruelest thing was the smell. For some inexplicable reason, there were days when he could smell the scent of lavender in the hallway, a scent so faint that perhaps only his guilt could capture it. It was as if she passed by without being seen, just to remind him that she still existed in every detail. The absence became a presence that tightened his chest, that made his stomach churn, that made his throat dry in the middle of important meetings. He tried to disguise it, swallow it, pretend, but no one can escape what they have planted. And Douglas, even surrounded by power, had watered his own loneliness with his indifference. One day, she walked into the office, and the radio that Elena always turned on was out of place. No one had touched it. It was turned off with the antenna retracted, but the dial was turned to the same station as always, the one that played the old songs she loved. He didn't touch the radio. He just sat in the armchair and stared into space, feeling everything. The house was now a museum of what he was afraid to feel, and there was no key, no money, no time that could open that door again. It was others who began to notice first, friends, business associates, even the private driver who had been driving Douglas around for years with the same impassive expression. There was something strange in his eyes, a kind of opacity that didn't match the confident, pragmatic, impenetrable man everyone knew. In meetings, he seemed distracted. In conversations, he responded in short sentences, as if his attention were always halfway elsewhere. He began to forget names, mix up dates, and misspell numbers that had previously come out of his mouth as if they were tattooed on his mind. Some attributed it to stress, others to aging. But the truth was simpler and crueler. Douglas was suffering. One afternoon, one of the oldest partners called him in for a chat, not like a boss calls an employee, but like a friend who notices the crack before it collapses. "Are you okay?" he asked bluntly. Douglas nodded, as he always did, and changed the subject. But the silence that followed this exchange was more eloquent than any confession. He wasn't okay, and maybe he knew it. He just didn't. Nowhere to start to get rid of what he had built. A wall of control, of silence, of decisions that keep people away. He had protected himself so much from the pain that when it finally reached him, he no longer knew how to react. It was on one of those afternoons when I was trying to appear normal that he made a mistake. During a meeting about a new advertising campaign for the company, someone suggested the concept of an invisible presence. Douglas, almost in a whisper, muttered, like someone who cleans the house without making a sound, but changes everything. No one understood. Silence fell over the room for a few seconds. He cleared his throat, disguised himself, regained his focus. But inside him, something broke. It was the first time that pain had escaped outside, even if in a subtle way, even if coded. He began to walk more, perhaps trying to find his way through the streets that he had previously only crossed with his car, dark and the windows closed. He began to pay attention to ordinary people, to their small gestures, to the details. He observed vendors, mothers with children in their arms, elderly people sweeping the sidewalks, and, without understanding why, each of these scenes hurt him in a strange way. It was as if he were seeing the world for the first time, as if he had spent his entire life inside a bubble where feelings were treated as flaws, and now he was finally out of air. Douglas began to write. Not letters, not emails, just loose sentences, scattered thoughts that he scribbled on napkins, on loose sheets of paper, on the notepad on his cell phone. He was neither a poet nor a romantic, but there was something that needed to come out, and everything somehow came back to her, to the woman who never raised her voice, who never made demands, who never asked for recognition, but who now was the central point of his silent ruin. His friends advised him to travel, to clear his head, to meet new people. But how can he replace what cannot be named? How can he erase a perfume impregnated in the walls of his soul? The answer wasn't coming, and he knew deep down that it wouldn't come any time soon, because some losses don't scream. They just stay there, discreet, firm, and ever deeper. He tried to move forward the only way he knew how, by replacing. That was how he dealt with losses, failures, and gaps. He replaced the part, and the system kept running. That was why he hired a new cleaning team. He chose the best, professionals with impeccable references, recommended by companies that served millionaires like himself. He didn't want involvement, or stories, or long looks. He wanted efficiency. And in the first few days, that's exactly what he got. The house was clean, schedules were respected, reports were left on the table, cold as contracts. But order was not enough. There was an absence that no amount of cleaning could erase. The plants began to wilt despite the water. The floor gleamed, but the light hit the window strangely. The old radio that Elena always turned on remained off, and even when Douglas tried to turn it back on, the sound seemed different. The music came on, but without life. It was not the same radio. It was as if the device had been silenced by the very absence of her. The new employees avoided eye contact. They treated Douglas with professional distance, just as he demanded. But this coldness, once desired, now suffocated him. One morning, while drinking coffee on the porch, Douglas heard a bird singing. It was the same one Elena imitated when she dusted the windows. He closed his eyes for a second and felt his chest tighten. The sound seemed to mock him, as if nature itself knew that this house no longer belonged to anyone. It was a mansion without a soul, and he, a king exiled from himself. He tried to ignore it, but the discomfort grew. In an online meeting in the background of the camera, one of the new employees appeared briefly, cleaning the hallway mirror. The partners didn't comment, but one of them smiled strangely. And Douglas realized no one respected that space like they used to. Before, everyone took care of it. Now it was just service. It was just appearance. On an impulse that not even he understood, Douglas entered the old service room. It was empty, but there were still marks on the floor where the closet had been. He sat on the small folding bed that remained there and stared at the wall. He touched the switch. Nothing. The light had burned out and no one had bothered to change it. It was a forgotten corner, as if everything Eleanor had touched had been erased in a hurry. But not enough, because there, right in the corner of the wall, a small sticker with the image of a blue butterfly was still stuck. He recognized it. She liked discreet things, small ornaments that no one saw, but that made the world less heavy. He touched the sticker with his fingers, and for an instant he felt that Elena was there. That she saw him, that she knew. He left the room as if he were running away from a ghost. That night he couldn't eat. It wasn't hunger. It was a lump. Something was clogging his throat, as if every attempt to continue was punished by memory. And even with all his rationality, Douglas understood there is no substitute for what is genuine. He tried to recreate what she did, in the gestures, in the details, but it was all fake. The way she folded the cloths, the way she played the music, even the way she watered the plants. Everything had a different weight when it came from another heart. And then there, in silence, Douglas realized he didn't want someone to clean the house. He wanted Elena back, but he didn't know how to say it. And maybe it was already too late. It was while he was searching for an old document in the hallway closet that he found something he hadn't expected. Among worn-out folders, invoices for renovations, and forgotten projects, there was a carefully folded beige envelope with no return address. Douglas hesitated instinctively. It hadn't been there before, or at least he'd never noticed it. The paper had a faint, familiar scent, lavender, of course, and the weight of something that carried more than words. When he opened it, he found a handwritten sheet of paper with soft, slanted, unhurried handwriting. It was from Elena. "Mr. Hamilton, if this letter ever reaches your hands, it will not be by chance. I kept these words out of respect, not out of hope. Because silence also speaks, and I always knew that you listened, even when pretending not to. I'm not writing to say goodbye, but out of gratitude. Thank you for allowing me to enter this house, even if only through my eyes. I never asked for your affection, and I never needed it. But believe me, every corner I cleaned with care. Every tea I prepared was a way of silently praying for your tiredness, and every plant I watered carried within me a plea that you one day would allow yourself to bloom." Douglas sat on the floor. He read the letter once more, and then once more. His hand was shaking, his eyes too. There was too much truth in that paper, and that was what hurt. Because she never demanded anything, never complained, never insinuated herself. But she loved. She loved without a name, without intention, without destiny. And now, even after leaving, she still cared for him. Even after everything. Even after the sharp cut, the veiled contempt, the coldly closed door. It was as if, when she wrote that letter, she had left a candle lit in a dark hallway. He didn't deserve it, but there he was. And it was at that moment that Douglas understood the kind of love he had lost. It wasn't the love of words, of kisses, of promises. It was a love of presence, of silent permanence, of someone who loves the other even without space to exist. And for that very reason, Elena was irreplaceable. Because what she did for him wasn't in the contract. It was in his heart. And now, too late, he felt that the only part of the house that still made sense was precisely the one he had sent away. He held the letter in both hands, as if it were a piece of time he could freeze. He took a deep breath. He thought about writing a reply, but he had nowhere to send it. He thought about calling, but he didn't know if he would be welcome. He thought about going to where she lived, but he didn't know if he would have the courage. Because now, the man who had always had all the answers was faced with the one question he had never known how to face. How do you ask forgiveness from someone who has never asked for anything? That night, for the first time in years, Douglas cried, not silently, not with control. He cried like a boy who has lost the one thing he has never known how to name, and deep within that cry there was a whisper. She was there, all along, and he didn't see it. It was late one grey afternoon that fate decided to reopen a door that Douglas believed was locked forever. He had gone out for a walk without a destination, a recent habit that he used as an excuse to run away from home. He walked through ordinary streets, as if he were looking for something he couldn't explain. And then, turning a corner near an older neighborhood in the city, something made him stop. It was a small community school, with low gates and worn paint. Children ran around the courtyard laughing loudly, and a lady watched everything sitting on a wooden bench with a notebook on her lap. She wasn't Elena, but that look, that way of caring without speaking, was enough to make something click inside him. The next morning, still holding the envelope, Douglas opened the old employee registration form, which he kept locked in a safe in the office. I didn't know if he was looking for practical information or an emotional excuse. He found Elena's address, and next to it, a phone number that she didn't even know still existed. He called. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. He thought about giving up, but something kept pulling him forward, an impulse that mixed guilt and need. He wasn't a man to chase after someone. But with her, everything seemed to require a different approach. He decided to go to the address. He took with him the envelope, the old radio, and the handkerchief she had left. I didn't know what I would say. I didn't even know if I would be received. But I could no longer pretend that everything was fine. He arrived at the indicated place, a simple little house with a modest garden and a lace curtain fluttering in the window. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding. It wasn't Elena who answered. She was a young woman, with similar features, maybe in her early 20s. He hesitated. His voice was low, almost unrecognizable. "Excuse me, does Elena still live here?" The girl smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mrs. Elena is my mother. She's there in the yard with the little one. Would you like to come in?" He didn't know what to say, he just nodded. He entered as if he were stepping on sacred ground, and there, sitting on a straw chair with a little girl on her lap, was she, her hair a little whiter, but with the same look he had avoided for so long. She looked up, and for a second the world seemed to stop. There was no drama, there was no accusation, just a silence filled with everything that was left unsaid. Eleanor smiled slightly. "Mr. Hamilton, I never thought I'd see you here." He approached her slowly, as if he feared she would disappear. He handed her the envelope. "I found this. Too late, perhaps. But I had to come." She took the paper, taking her time. She read it. She took a deep breath. It wasn't late. It was when you were ready. That broke him. How could she still be so generous? He wanted to ask many things. He wanted to know if she hated him, if she felt hurt, if she had ever thought about going back. But he didn't ask anything, because he understood at that moment that there were questions that silence answered better. The little girl in Elena's lap was holding a rag toy. Douglas looked at her. "Your granddaughter?" Elena nodded, proud. "My daughter's daughter. Life always blooms, even after pruning." It was a simple sentence, but for him it carried an entire universe. He realized that there, in that humble backyard, there was more love than in all the cold rooms of his mansion, and that she had moved on, without him, without needing to look back. But still, she received it, without resentment, without demands, and that hurt more than any punishment, because true karma was not being hated. It was being forgiven by someone who had every reason not to forgive. He returned home with his world turned upside down. He didn't say anything to anyone. He simply went inside, closed the door, and leaned his forehead against the cold wood, as if that could bring him back in time. But time doesn't go back. And he knew that. He climbed the stairs slowly, as if he were stepping on the remains of a castle he himself had demolished. He went to the office, turned on the radio he had brought with him to the meeting, and let the same station play. The music that came out of the speakers was old, but full of life. For the first time in months, that sound didn't seem empty. Maybe because now he knew where the heart that once gave meaning to everything was. In the days that followed, Douglas began to move differently. He didn't announce any changes. He didn't tell anyone about his visit, but he began to see things differently. He asked to cancel the contracts with the service companies and discreetly began to take care of the house with his own hands. Without technique, without perfection, but with truth. He got up earlier and opened the windows by himself. He tried to make coffee the way he remembered her making it, even if it was bitter. He started listening to more music, watering the plants calmly, placing fresh flowers on the kitchen table. It wasn't imitation, it was learning. He didn't want to replace Elena. He wanted to honor what she had silently taught him. One rainy afternoon, while walking through a local bookstore, he found a notebook with an embroidered cover. Without thinking, he bought it. And that night he sat at the table in the living room, the same one where she left notes with verses and phrases of care, and began to write. Not for her, for himself. He wrote about mistakes, about the distance he used as a shield, about the pain he pretended not to feel, about the fear of loving. For the first time, Douglas was honest. He constructed with words the request for forgiveness that he never had the courage to say out loud. Page by page, he was tearing down the walls that separated him from himself. On one of those days of silent reconstruction, he received a letter. With no sender, with the same light scent that came from Elena's old letter. Inside, just a photo. It was her granddaughter, sitting on the same bench in the backyard holding the old radio. In the background, a shadow, Elena smiling in profile. And behind the photo, a single handwritten sentence. Some presences don't need to come back and never leave again. Douglas held that image for long minutes. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just felt. And it was then that he understood. What he lost would never be recovered. But it could be honored. And that sometimes, the greatest punishment is not the loss. It's the awareness of what one had and didn't know how to take care of. The following week, he created a foundation in Elena's mother's name, something she had mentioned only once, while she was washing the porch. My mother used to say that those who care for you with love will never be forgotten. It was a belated promise, but it was true. The foundation would help women start over, quietly, without fanfare, just as she had always done. The newspapers reported the news as a philanthropic gesture by an introspective millionaire. But no one knew the truth. Only he. Only the empty hallway, only the radio, playing softly, as if it knew that now, finally, someone was listening. The days had returned to order, but not the kind he had known. Before, order had been made of control, schedules, contracts, command. Now it was made of meaning. Every small gesture Douglas made carried the weight of someone who had lost and had chosen not to pretend anymore. The house was still large, silent, elegant. But something had changed. Not on the outside, but in the way he inhabited each room. He stopped walking hurriedly. He began to touch objects with more care, as if each one held a memory that now deserved respect. Visitors noticed something different. No one said it out loud, but the environment seemed less cold, less untouchable. And maybe that was it. For the first time, that house seemed inhabited by a man who felt. On a clear Sunday, Douglas decided to visit the community school where he had seen Eleanor for the first time since they had said goodbye. He didn't tell anyone, he just showed up. He was carrying 2 boxes, one with children's books that he had chosen himself, the other with new utensils for the school kitchen. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. But when she saw him, one of the volunteers recognized him, not as the businessman, but as the man on the park bench who had been looking at the children as if he were looking for something he had lost. He smiled. For the first time in years, he smiled genuinely. When Elena saw him, she wasn't surprised. It was as if I had already known, as if I had felt that somehow he would come back. This time, he sat down next to her. No words were spoken for the first few minutes. They just watched their granddaughter play with other children in the yard. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was mature. It was filled with everything they had once been unable to say. Until, without taking his eyes off the horizon, he said, "I wronged you." Elena didn't answer right away. She just lowered her head and took a deep breath. "You didn't wrong me, Mr. Hamilton. You wronged yourself. And now you're making amends." That went through Douglas like a sweet sentence. Because it was true. The pain he carried wasn't just because of her absence. It was because of the man he had been while she was there. From that day on, he began to visit the school frequently. He helped out as much as he could, brought discreet donations, and told stories to the children. It wasn't charity, it was reconstruction. It was a way of touching the world with hands that had previously only signed contracts. And little by little, without him realizing it, people began to approach him. Children called him by name. Parents thanked him for his presence, and employees commented that he had a quiet but kind manner. He, who had always shielded himself from the world, was now part of it. And yet, every day when she returned home, she would pass by the laundry room and leave a flower on the machine. No one saw it, no one knew, but he knew. That was where she began her day. That was where her presence was most felt. It was the altar of her transformation. As the months passed, Douglas became almost unrecognizable, at least to those who had known him before. The stiffness in his shoulders gave way to a strange lightness, as if he were finally learning to breathe. His eyes, which had always been half closed behind a calculating expression, now lingered on people's faces, searching for something more than efficiency. He had discovered, belatedly, that the world is not made of successes. It is made of presences, and no one taught him this more powerfully than Elena, through her absence. His house, although physically the same, had become a space of silent healing. Each day, he reopened a room he had previously avoided. He cleaned with his own hands the windows he used to have cleaned. He replaced flowers he had never known how to grow. He made a point of turning on the lights in the late afternoon, as she did, as if to tell the house, "You are not alone." Some of the old employees began to return, not as employees, but as collaborators in the social projects that Douglas now financed. When they asked him what had happened, he would simply answer with a smile and no explanation. There was no need to justify what only the heart understands. One day, while rearranging the books on the shelf, he found a small box that he had never noticed before. Inside was the white mug with his name on it, the one Elena had used to serve him tea on cold days. It was intact, wrapped in a cloth embroidered with the phrase, "For the days when the soul forgets where it came from." He held the object like sacred glass, and in a way it was. One Monday morning, Douglas decided to do something unusual. He wrote a letter, not by email, not by text message. A handwritten letter. It took hours, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of respect. He wrote each word as if he were restoring a temple. He didn't put a name or greeting on the envelope. He simply left it on the porch of the school, where Eleanor taught reading workshops for older women. She would find it, he knew, and if she did, she would understand. Because the letter didn't apologize. It wasn't a gesture of redemption. It was an offering, an acknowledgement, a saying, "I saw it. Late, but I saw it." Eleanor didn't answer. She never spoke about the envelope. But a few days later, when he passed by the school porch, he saw something that only he would understand, a lavender flower on the wooden bench. That was all. And that was enough, because there was forgiveness, and with it, the greatest lesson she could give. Some stories don't need to be retold in order to move on. It's enough to honor what was lived, and to transform what's left. Douglas continued visiting the school, taking care of the house, watering the garden, now full of flowers that she said she liked. And every Sunday she would sit on the porch with a cup from the white mug, listening to the same radio station. It was her ritual, her way of saying without words that she finally understood, that she finally felt, that she was finally there, whole. It was winter when it happened, one of those days when the wind seemed to blow memories instead of leaves. Douglas woke up before the sun rose. He felt something different in the air. It wasn't fear, nor anticipation. It was as if time was folding in on itself. He got up, made his tea as he did every day, in the same white mug at the same temperature. He sat on the porch and let the silence speak. It was then that he saw something approaching slowly. An old, discreet car stopped in front of the gate. A woman got out. It wasn't Elena, it was his daughter. She was holding her granddaughter, the same one in the photo, and in the girl's arms, something that made the world spin for a second. The old radio, the one that had once played just for him. The young woman approached with calm steps, her gaze steady. She held out the radio carefully without saying a word. Douglas was left breathless. She touched the object, as if touching the living memory of everything he had not been able to keep. But it was what she said right after that made his heart skip a beat. "My mother asked me to give it to you when you were ready." He didn't understand. Ready for what? She smiled, her eyes identical to her mother's. To listen. And then she pointed to a small note stuck to the bottom of the radio. It was from Elena herself. "When pain becomes listening, you will understand my song." Douglas turned on the radio right there. The sound that came out wasn't just music. It was a recording. Her voice, singing softly a song he knew by heart but had never known the words to. A lullaby. a melody made to care for those who don't know how to ask for care. He closed his eyes. And there, faced with what was left of absence, karma fulfilled its cycle. Because he who had always protected himself from love with the excuse of professionalism was now sustained by exactly what he had despised: silent love. The following days were different. Elena's daughter began to visit him frequently. She brought the girl, who already called him Grandpa Doug, even though she didn't really know what that meant. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no emotional conversations, but there was presence. And for the first time, Douglas understood that redemption doesn't happen in shouting. It happens in repeated gestures, in restored care, in listening without defense. He began to record tapes with invented stories dedicated to the girl. He began to teach her the names of the plants in the garden and let her choose the new pots on the balcony. It was a way of giving back to time what he couldn't give Eleanor. And then, one particularly bright afternoon, Douglas received a package. It was a small painting wrapped in recycled paper. No note, no return address. When he opened it, he found a simple painting, the hallway of his house empty, lit by an open window. On the floor, an elongated shadow of a woman in an apron, barely visible, like a whisper of light. The signature in the bottom corner read simply, E. He didn't cry, he just smiled, and he hung the painting in the entrance to his house, in the most visible place. And there he left it, not as a souvenir, but as an altar. Because sometimes the greatest karma is not being punished. It is being transformed. It is recognizing the greatness of those who loved us in silence, and with that love, starting life over with both feet on the ground and an open heart. If this story touched your heart, click the button like right now. That shows us you want more stories like this. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos that are already in production with the same care and emotion. And leave a comment. Silent love never goes away. Only those who felt it will understand. Now don't leave yet. The next video is already appearing on the screen. Click on it and continue with us on this journey of stories that touch us deeply, because maybe the next chapter is exactly what you need to hear today.